How's it going, guys? Nathan here, back with another Magic the Gathering deck tech featuring Torbran, Thane of Redfell. This is one of my favorite decks in my collection because it has a singular focus on burning your opponents out, not too complicated, and it also tends to speed up games tremendously. So if I want to maybe close out the night without a lot of thinking, or perhaps I just want a quick game, then this is the deck that I break out to sort of cap off a night of Commander. Torbran is a 2/4 dwarf noble that says if a red source you control will deal damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, it deals that much damage +2 instead. So this applies to both non-combat damage and combat damage, effectively incentivizing a go-wide strategy, first of all, because 1/1 creatures can deal 3 damage in combat. In addition, it works very well with pingers and cards that have some sort of payoff for casting certain spell types. So the core of this deck is built around casting instants or sorceries to trigger cards like Electrostatic Field or Fiery Inscription, and also to have those instants and sorceries make creatures to trigger our other setup pieces like Impact Tremors and Perforos, God of the Forge. So that's the basic goal of the deck, and it has quite a bit of card draw built in because red has always sort of suffered with card draw through the years. Admittedly, it's gotten better in 2024. However, I find that I often run out of gas considering the curve of this deck is lower than 3. So there's a decent amount of card draw built into the deck, a little bit of ramp just to make sure we accelerate so we're casting multiple spells. And beyond that, it's really just burn pieces, amplifiers, and setup pieces. So before we get into the individual cards within the deck, I'd like to cover some basic stats. First, we have the converted mana cost of the deck. Now, I use Moxfield to calculate this custom mana curve, which clocks in at 2.89. As you can see, we have a pretty smooth curve here, and with Torbran sitting on the number 4 curve, we have quite a low curve compared to what you would sort of consider an average mid-range deck. For our lands, we have 33 red producers, 4 colorless producers, and this is a pretty quick mana base because only 6 of our lands enter tapped, and we have a decent bit of utility also built in. What you might notice with the land base off the bat is that we are running a pretty high number of mountains, and that's because there is a couple of cards that rely on the number of mountains we have. For example, Valakut the Molten Pinnacle, which I'll cover in a little bit. And we also have an actual snow centerpiece in the form of Frostbite, which relies on snow permanence. So let's go over to Moxfield really quick to look at the cost of the deck as well. I think that this is probably a stat I should start covering more. I tend to proxy a lot of my decks. In fact, I don't have this deck. I have this deck in paper, but it's all proxied. And that is sort of a factor when people are looking at potentially buying cards. However, I highly encourage people to just simply proxy cards that are particularly expensive. So with that out of the way, we can get into some of the analysis here. So let's start with the core of the deck. What are our setup pieces that we can capitalize on to start burning out our opponents? There's a couple of different categories. Like I mentioned before, we're relying on non-creature based setup pieces and also creature based setup pieces. So we'll stick with the non-creatures first. Electrostatic Field is going to deal 1 damage to each opponent on every instant and sorcery cast, and it makes for a decent defender early in the game. Erebor Flamesmith is going to do the same thing, but it's a little bit of a weaker body, which, explains why it's at the common level, but this is still exactly what we want to be playing on turn 2. Fiery Inscription is going to be essentially a gutter snipe effect, but on an enchantment, so a little bit harder to remove. And it also, we get a ring temptation trigger off of that, which we don't necessarily need to use, but it can actually help with our tokens by giving them effectively skulk. And that helps to then deal extra damage with Torbran if they can get through with that tiny amount of power. Firebrand Archer is the same concept. It's essentially a copy of Erebor Flamesmith, almost word for word. However, it does trigger on non-creature spells. So this is one of the best cards in this category. And we have Gutter Snipe, which is a classic, pretty old card, but it will deal 2 damage to each opponent instead, with Torbran out multiplying that up to 4. Kessig Flame Breather is similar to Firebrand Archer, but with higher toughness, which I think is pretty great. Actually, let's see, do 1 damage to each opponent. Yeah, so I think this is a straight upgrade from Firebrand Archer because it can block some of the utility creatures that we might face on the battlefield. And Thermo Alchemist, which is effectively the same trigger off of instants and sorceries, but you have to remember to tap and untap it, which is very minor. Occasionally you will flub up on, missing a trigger to say, oh, actually, can I, tap it because I forgot I need to untap it and stuff. And mostly your opponents, I think, will be okay with that at a casual table. So there's 7 pieces there that will set us up for non-creature spell casts. And if we do a bit of the back of the napkin math, what I like to assume is that there will be, first I like to calculate the odds of having one of these pieces in your hand and one of these pieces that you'll see over the course of a game. So if we assume that in our opening hand we'll have 7 cards, and in a game, we'll see about 20 of those cards, give or take. These are the odds that I like to calculate. So we have 7 divided by 99 times 7 cards in hand. So we'll, on average, see 1/2 of these in an opening hand. And then, or I'm sorry, 1/2 meaning half of a card. So effectively, you would need to see 14 cards in your deck to have the probability of drawing 1 card in this category. Then for our 20 test, we're going to do 7 divided by 99 times 20. So over the course of a game, we'll see 1 card on average and maybe up to 2, depending on how we draw. All right. We'll move on to creature-based burn. So we have 6 cards in this category. Goblin Bombardment is going to help capitalize on any creatures we have in play. Often it might be profitable to simply swing at an opponent, and then it doesn't even matter how they block. If you are able to deal damage, that's great, and then any creatures that would die in combat, you just sack to Goblin Bombardment to then deal effectively 3 damage to any target. So this effectively reads, sacrifice a creature, deals 3 damage, assuming Torbran is on the field, to any target. So that's pretty great. Hellrider has been kind of an all-star. It's a 4-mana 3/3 devil with haste. Whenever a creature you control attacks, Hellrider deals 1 damage to the player or planeswalker it's attacking. So that triggers on every creature. And so with our go wide strategy, this can often ping opponents for up to 9 to 12 damage a turn, which is pretty fantastic, and it also triggers off of itself. So again, we're kind of evaluating these cases with Torbran on the field because that will be the goal, and we'll talk about some backups if Torbran were to be removed. Impact Tremors is going to be the perfect turn to play, and in fact, you might even consider this in certain pods more of a combo piece. Rather than playing it on turn 2, you might wait to slam this and then play something like a Hordling Outburst for 5 mana, where you get the Torbran benefit so that you don't appear as scary, or you can sort of hold back your strategy to your opponents without sort of becoming the problem at the table. Perforos, God of the Forge, is an absolute all-star. This is just one of the best cards in the deck, and it's, I think, honestly, one of the best red cards ever printed. It is a God 6/5 indestructible, and effectively it says whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, it deals 2 damage to each opponent, which gets multiplied to 4 with Torbran out. Terror of the Peaks. 5/4 flyer, spells your opponent's cast to target Terror of the Peaks costs an additional 3 life to cast, which is not multiplied by the damage effect or damage amplifying effect of Torbran, notably. But, however, it says whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, this card deals damage equal to that creature's power to any target. So it effectively becomes an Impact Tremors, assuming that we're playing a bunch of 1/1s onto the field, and that can get even better if we were to play some of our better or higher power creatures, such as what is the new dragon that came out in Caverns of Ixalan? Bonehorde Dracosaur, for example. And then finally in this category we have a Witty Roastmaster, which is a 3/2. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, Witty Roastmaster deals 1 damage to each opponent. And just another Impact Tremors effect. So redundancy is key in this deck. And so honestly, with what I like to do is sort of lump this category together into our setup pieces. So if we were to just redo our calculation, assuming that we will get, or we're sort of lumping this into one category, our 13 divided by 99 times 7 is that we will basically be guaranteed to hit 1 card in our setup category, in our opener, and then we will see 13 divided by 99 times 20 is on average about 3 cards per game. So I think that's good redundancy, because if you assume that, 1, maybe even 2 get sniped off the field, or maybe they succumb to a board wipe, then you are still going to draw 1 or 2 more. All right, and then let's look at the capitalizers in the deck. There are some other miscellaneous burn pieces, which I'll get to in a second, but I want to move into what are the cards we want to be casting right after we play one of these setup pieces. So Burn Down the House is a 5 mana. Also, the art is sick on this card. I absolutely love this. Choose 1. This card deals 5 damage to each creature and each planeswalker, which can effectively be a board wipe in a pinch. However, what we usually want to be doing is casting it for its second mode, which is create 3 1/1 red devil creature tokens with when this creature dies, it deals 1 damage to any target. They gain haste until end of turn. That is a key part of this card. So you might say 5 mana to create 3 1/1s. That's not very good. That's not very on rate. However, in the context of this deck, that synergy we're working towards is it an instant or sorcery? Check. That will burn our opponents on cast. Then it's going to make the tokens that will also burn our opponents when they enter. 3 triggers with an Impact Tremors on the board and Torbran on the board is going to deal 9 to each opponent. And then they have the extra text on top of that, where they gain haste, so they are effectively 3/1s with Torbran on the field to deal combat damage. And then if we don't have a profitable combat and they die, they still deal 3 damage with Torbran on the field. I feel like I need to asterisk this every time. With Torbran on the field, they deal 3 damage to any target, so it represents an additional 9 damage. And, even better if you have something like a Goblin Bombardment to double up on those damage triggers. So Burn Down the House, a great flexible card that wants to be doing pretty much everything we want to be doing. Dragon Fodder is a 2 mana, just create 2 1/1 tokens. This isn't going to be an all-star in Commander. It's not very splashy. However, this checks all the boxes for what we want to be doing. Is it instant or sorcery? Does it create tokens? That's perfect. Forbidden Friendship is going to be effectively the same thing, except it's going to make a dinosaur and a human soldier. Goblin War Party is... Goblin War Party is a 4 mana, create 3 1/1 goblin creature tokens, and then if you have the extra mana, you can entwine it. We're generally not going to choose the second mode, although you technically can, but I would say either it's a 4 mana create 3 1/1s, or you entwine it for 7, where those 3 1/1s enter as 2/2s and gain haste. Hordling Outburst, again, checks the box of very simple instance or sorcery that makes tokens to create 3 1/1 goblins. Molten Birth, this is probably the weakest card out of this category because it's only a 3 mana create 2 1/1 elementals. However, you have the option to, you basically have a 50-50 chance for when you cast this to then return it to your hand to cast it another time. 3 mana to create 2/2s is what is not on rate for what we would like, considering we have alternatives like Dragon Fodder. But it's in the deck because there are limited choices in terms of this sort of category of instants or sorceries that makes tokens. Tempt with Vengeance. So with tempting offer cards, I always assume that your opponents won't take the deal. In practice, it is very rare for opponents to actually also make the tokens unless they are in very, very desperate straits. And the nature of this deck is that you tend to burn the whole table over time. So I've never actually had an opponent take the offer with this because typically there's some sort of synergy piece on the field. So we're going to evaluate this as if X is just what we pay into it. So create X 1/1 red elemental creature tokens with haste, and then each opponent may create as many of those, and for each opponent who does, you create that many as well. So this is not necessarily on rate in terms, it kind of falls under that Molten Birth category where we might be paying 4 mana for 3 1/1s. However, the key part of this card that makes it great is that they gain haste, so that effectively we're creating X 3/1s with Torbran on the field that can then deal combat damage if we see a profitable attack, or they can just sit and just proc triggers off of our synergy pieces. You see a pair of goblins is a similar effect to Molten Birth. Choose one creature you control, get +2/+0 until end of turn. Almost never going to use that. The second mode, however, create 2 1/1 red goblin creature tokens is what we would like to be doing. All right, so that is going to essentially be the instances of sources that make creatures that will trigger both of these categories. Now, what are some cards that only trigger off of the non-creature based burn? So this category I like to call burn instants and sorceries, just to sort of lump it into more of a type category. Fiery Confluence is great in this deck because we're doing 3 instances of effectively 2 damage to each opponent most of the time. So with Torbran out, this becomes Fiery Confluence deals 12 damage to each opponent. However, we have a lot of flexibility in that it can be a board wipe by dealing effectively 9 damage to each creature with Torbran out. Or we can destroy 3 artifacts if there are some stacks pieces or something that are slowing down the game plan. Grapeshot is going to be a great finisher. I think it's pretty obvious what this card is going to do, but essentially it has Storm and it deals 1 damage to target creature or player. And for those of you who might not know, Storm does, when he casts a spell, copy for each spell cast before this turn. So this is great in 2 ways. First of all, it stacks up the actual damage triggers, so you have more damage triggers just by instead of dealing a whole bunch of damage all at once to maximize that Torbran value. And then second of all, hold on, let me look at, so Grapeshot copies the spells. You don't cast them, so let me check. I'm pretty sure this doesn't actually work with our non-creatures, which I just actually realized. Okay, so the multiple spells part won't work because the Storm triggers are copies of the spell. They don't actually necessarily count as being cast, so they won't trigger something like our Fire Inscription off of the sort of 2 damage to each opponent. But it's still a great card because we have just a bunch of 1 damage triggers that we can point at anywhere. We can even snipe creatures if there are some sort of creatures that are that will represent lethal to us. Korvath's Fury is a 5 mana for each player. Choose friend or foe. Each friend discards all cards from their hand, then draws that many cards +1. Or Korvath's Fury. Oh wait. Okay. So let me reread this card. So we're gonna choose friend for ourselves and foe for everyone else. So that might not always happen depending on what we want to do, but what we're going to choose for our opponents is for Korvath's Fury to deal damage to each foe equal to the number of cards in their hand. Generally, I would say most of the time we want to be choosing friend for ourselves because we can effectively just get a fresh hand. However, that might not be super good in certain instances when we have certain cards we want to keep in hand. But the thought with that is that you just wouldn't cast the spell until you want to utilize that hand refreshing effect. But this will represent a lot of damage to your opponents, assuming that your opponents always have roughly 4 cards in their hand on average. With Torbran out, that is amplified to 6, again assuming kind of the average is between 3 and 4. So effectively 5 mana to burn each opponent for 6, or potentially more than that, is a great include in this deck. Price of Progress is one of my favorite red cards, just period, and the fact that this is instant is pretty crazy. 2 mana, deals damage to each player equal to twice the number of non-basic lands that player controls. In Commander, we all know that there are greedy mana bases running around. I am guilty. I would absolutely get dumpstered by a Price of Progress in pretty much all of my decks, and it's one of the reasons why we run such a high mountain count, so as to minimize the effect of this card. But this represents just a huge amount of damage, and with Torbran out, it's even better. All right, let me cover our sort of miscellaneous burn categories, and then we'll move on to some amplifiers. So there is a couple of cards that just generically burn for a decent amount of damage. Fanatic of Mogus is one of my favorite red cards as well, because it actually capitalizes. I think it's one of the only cards that capitalizes on red devotion. It deals damage to each opponent equal to your devotion to red, which Torbran, by the way, is 3 devotion on its own. So if you have Torbran out and then you follow it up with Fanatic of Mogus, that's 4 damage minimum. In most cases, I think you would even have more than that. So, you know, your average case, I think, is between 4 and 5, something like that, or between 4 and 6. So the average case of this card is 4 mana, deal 6 to each opponent, which is great because then you have a 4/2 body afterwards. So just a pretty great card there as well. And then Pyrohemia, 4 mana at the beginning of the end step. If no creatures on the battlefield, sack Pyrohemia. However, what we are using it for is 1 red. You can pay at any time. Pyrohemia deals 1 damage to each creature and each player. So you can hold people hostage with this card. You can burn people with this card. I haven't yet run into a case where I've had to sacrifice Pyrohemia, just because you can see what's on the battlefield. Typically, somebody has a creature that has a higher amount of toughness, and you can really nuke token decks with this. And with Torbran out, each red mana represents 3 damage to each player. So effectively, you pay 3 mana to deal 9 damage to each player. That's awesome. And Torbran notably only says to an opponent, so yes, we'll be dealing damage to ourselves with Pyrohemia. However, it's only the 1 instead of the 3. Finally, we have a great stacks piece that is another reason why we're not running a lot of non-basics. Burning Earth is an enchantment, 4 mana enchantment. Whenever a player taps a non-basic land for mana, Burning Earth deals 1 damage to that player. This will burn people, I think, for the most amount within the deck. I have never seen this card deal less than, I would say, 15 damage. And this also applies to ourselves. So again, symmetrical effect, but we're not going to be as harmed by this because we just run more basics. So the cautionary tale for this card, I will warn, is this card almost immediately makes you the arch enemy at the table. And I will say it will, it generally takes about a turn for opponents to realize how much damage this card will end up doing to them. So typically it's like you play this pass, and then the first person to then go sort of doesn't realize how much it's going to deal, and typically they will tap a lot and take a bunch of damage. Now after that, the next opponents, even though you sort of know what the card is going to do, it's like seeing that much damage is a little bit scary. So when I've seen this in action, it usually takes like half of a turn cycle for the psychological effect of this card to really sink in. And people are going to either immediately remove this enchantment, or you're going to be the arch enemy. So I would recommend having some blockers on the field first, or playing this well, if opponents have a lot of life, they might be willing to just tap mana anyway. So I was going to say maybe even early in the game, this would be great to just slam on turn 4, just assuming that it will get removed. Because even if you consider this is 4 mana, even if it'll get removed in 1 turn cycle, it's still going to deal 4 to 5 damage to each opponent, even if it's turn 4. That's like the floor case, assuming that opponents tap out. So that's still worth 4 mana. And again, if this is being multiplied with Torbran to do 3 damage on every mana tap, that is just absolutely devastating. So Burning Earth, one of my favorite cards. There's a similar card here. Let me see if I have it in the maybe board. Let me just see if I can find it here. There's a similar 4 mana card that does a similar impression to this. There are other sort of stacks pieces that I've considered, like Parasitic Pillar, Rampaging Ferocidon, Spitfire Lagak, but I thought there was an enchantment that I wanted to show. Anyway, I'll show it on the screen in the post-editing, but it does a similar impression there, and but I just like Burning Earth because it really is more towards our opponents because we're just running so many more basics than them. All right, so let's go to the vegetables part of the deck. We covered the meat and potatoes, the things we want to be doing. What is the support looking like for this deck? So we'll just run through the ramp category really quick. We've got our typical Arcane Signet. We've got Dockside Extortionist. Now, I will say Dockside has a pretty bad reputation in the Commander community just because it's so powerful. And I have considered cutting this guy just because of that power level. Like, it is kind of, it just produces that like disgust feeling at the table, but it's still in the deck just because it does so much work. If other opponents are running treasures or if people are playing Mana Rocks, it's just a classic. It just makes you so much mana. So it can also fix us for those red pips in case we draw into like our colorless lands for some reason. So, take that for what you will. But mostly we're just using it as a ritual. And I'm, maybe considering even cutting this in favor of something like Mana Geyser because I really look at this more as a ritual than ramp. However, the treasures are a lot more valuable than mana that goes away at the end of the turn. Liquid Metal Torque, 2 mana. You can tap it for colorless, and notably, you can tap it to make something an artifact, which is great because we have a few different cards in our removal that only destroy artifacts. This is a great way for red to destroy enchantments or other non-land permanents, given that red always struggles with enchantments. And that is the similar for this deck. There just really aren't that many options outside of Chaos Warp. And I considered Guff Rewrites History, but let's see, do I have that in the maybe board? I don't. But this is sort of one of those other pieces that can allow us to maybe snipe an enchantment in sort of Magical Christmas lands. So, it's sometimes relevant. I will say that, even if it's 1 out of every 10 games, then that's still worthy of, running this over something like an Everflowing Chalice, for example. Mind Stone is a 2 mana, tap it for colorless, or you can tap sack it to draw a card, just some great card draw in a pinch. Neheb the Internal is a giant mana producer in this deck. It's a 4/6 zombie Minotaur warrior with Afflict 3. And notably, this is the most important part, at the beginning of your post-combat main phase, add red for each 1 life your opponents have lost this turn. So that triggers on all of your opponents, and in Commander, this makes just oodles of mana. I mean, you would probably cast this and then refund the mana cost immediately. For example, if this were to come down with an Impact Tremors on the battlefield and Torbran out, then you are effectively already making 6 mana off of this in your post-combat main phase just by playing Neheb the Internal. So you're mana positive the turn comes down. Ruben Medallion is just a great option in a mono red deck. Runaway Steamkin is, you know what? Hold on. Let me look at, as long as we're talking about Runaway Steamkin, Birgie. Okay, so I thought I had Birgie in this deck at some point, and I'm thinking whenever you cast a red spell. So Runaway Steamkin is whenever you cast a red spell, if Runaway Steamkin has fewer than 3/1 counters on it, put a 1/1 counter on Runaway Steamkin, and then remove 3/1 counters from it to then add 3 red mana from your mana pool, which you can activate at any time, but you have to have the 3 counters on it. I think the reason why I cut Birgie in exchange for this is that you can store the counters on Runaway Steamkin. I found that as I was casting spells, it didn't... Sometimes I wasn't able to use the red mana as it happened. However, I think honestly Birgie might be better, because if you sort of reread Birgie, so first of all, she says whenever you cast a spell, add red mana until end of turn. You don't lose this mana as steps and phases end, so you can use it in your second main. And then the other part we don't really care about. However, now that I reevaluate Birgie, I don't even know how to pronounce it, it effectively reads, red spells you cast cost 1 red pip less to cast, and I think I might actually substitute that in for Runaway Steamkin. I don't know. I'll have to do some experimenting with that. Runaway Steamkin does only cost 2 compared to Birgie's 3, so there is a bit of a difference in the turn that this can come down, but it's not huge. So I'll just put a caveat for Runaway Steamkin that this is still a little bit in experimentation phase. And then we have our classic Soul Ring. All right. And who doesn't like ramp without some card advantage? Lost Caverns of Ixalan gave us one of the best red creatures, dragons, that's pretty much ever been printed. 5/5 flying first strike. At the beginning of your upkeep, exile the top 2 cards of your library. You may play them this turn. So it effectively impulse draws you 2. If you exiled a land card this way, create a 3/1 red dinosaur creature token, which with Torbran out is effectively a 5/1. So triggering our impact tremors and all of our creature setup pieces. And then if you exiled a non-land card this way, create a treasure token. So it gives you the mana to cast the non-land cards you have impulse drawn. Just an absolute house. Now, the key part is that it doesn't do anything the turn comes down. So that's important. However, flying first strike 5/5, I mean, that is a heck of a defender, and so I don't see any issues with making it around to your next turn with this card out. Ignite the Future, 4 mana, exile the top 3 cards of your turn until the end of your next turn. You may play those cards. If this spell is cast from a graveyard, you may play cards this way without paying their mana costs. So this is great card advantage because not only is it effectively 4 mana draw, impulse draw 3, and the card draw that I have chosen in this deck specifically allows you to wait until your next turn to not only play the lands from exile, but also to allow you to regain the mana to then cast them. So that's why I like this type of effect. The Bornhorde Dracosaur, impulse drawing is okay, but if you can't, if you have to cast them this turn, it's not nearly as powerful as waiting until your next turn. And then the flashback cost is a pseudo finisher because you effectively can say, just cast the top 3 cards off your library for free, which might represent the last little bit of damage you need to finish out the game. Incendiary Command is a 5 mana. You can choose 2. Incendiary Command deals 4 damage to target player. Incendiary Command deals 2 damage to each creature. Destroy target non-basic land, or each player discards all the cards in his or her hand, then draws that many cards. So this is just one of the most flexible pieces in the deck. If we need some extra burn to finish somebody off, we can deal 8 damage without Torbran on the field. With Torbran on the field, it would represent 12. It can also be a board wipe in a pinch, and we can also get rid of the super annoying utility lands like Glacial Chasm, and if we need to, we can refresh our hand. So just a great flexible piece. Inspired Tinkering is essentially Jessica's Will at home. It is a 5 mana impulse draw 3 until the end of your next turn. You may play them and then create 3 treasure tokens. So it effectively only costs you 2 mana to impulse draw 3. So just a great rate, assuming that you have the 5 mana to cast this. Invasion of Kaldheim, which let me pull this up separately, is actually we'll go to Scryfall. That might make sense. 4 mana, 4 points on the battle. What are these called actually? Is this toughness? What do you call a battle number in the bottom right? I actually don't even know. Whenever a Invasion of Kaldheim enters the battlefield, exile all cards from your hand, then draw that many cards until the end of your next turn. You may play cards exiled this way. So effectively what this says is dump your hand, draw that many again, and then the cards that were in your hand you can still cast. So there's some condition there where you want to be able to cast and play lands from those cards, but this effectively doubles your hand size for a turn, which is absolutely stellar. And then it flips into, this one isn't as important, but it can kind of sort of matter. We can discard a land card. Pyre of the World Tree deals 2 damage to any target. With Torbran out, that becomes 4. Whenever you discard a land card, exile the top card of your library, you may play that card this turn. So the reason why this doesn't matter as much is that it's dependent on having lands in hand, which, you know, given the prevalence of impulse drawing instead of card draw, that's not going to really matter too much unless we're just flooded and we happen to draw or top deck some mountains when we don't want to. So this will not matter that much. I mean, it can matter 1 in every 100 games is what I would estimate. Jessica's Will, just a red classic. Choose one. If you control commanders, cast a spell, you may choose both. Add red for each card on target opponent's hand, and then impulse draw 3. Light up the stage. We're always going to be casting this for spectacle cost just because we deal so much damage in this deck. 1 mana, exile the top 2 cards of your library until the end of your next turn. You may play those cards. So just a great rate to impulse draw 2 for only 1 mana. Plarg and Nisari. Now this is a recent addition. I'm still experimenting with this card a little bit. It's a 5 mana 5/4 Orc Efreet. At the beginning of your upkeep, each player exiles cards from the top of their library until they exile a non-land card. An opponent chooses a non-land card exiled this way. You may cast up to 2 spells from among the other cards exiled this way without paying their mana costs. So it gives you 4 cards, and then an opponent chooses the best card to get rid of. Then you may cast the second and third best cards. So this is important because we have synergy with having creatures enter our field and also casting instants and sorceries. So even if we were to hit worst case scenario like a Nature's Lore, right? Something we can't even use. It counts as an instant or sorcery spell being cast, so it will trigger our synergy pieces. And then, obviously, if a creature that triggers our creature synergy pieces. The other thing to keep in mind with this effect is when you... So everybody will dig down until they hit something, so you're guaranteed to get the hit. The thing is, the opponent choosing will have a tough time if you, were to hit a perfect either synergy piece, amplifier, or any of the meat and potatoes of this deck. For example, let's say that we have Impact Tremors on the field, and with Plarg and Nisari, I happen to dig down and hit Burn Down the House. So the opponent is probably going to not want my spell that will trigger all of the synergies that it's intended to trigger, which means that we still get the best card from our opponent's decks and the second best card from our opponent's decks. So in addition, you can use this a little bit politically to maybe target the person who might give you the removal spell that you might need to, let's say you hit a generous gift. You say, let's see, because the trigger happens before you choose the opponent. It just says an opponent chooses a non-land card this way. So all of the cards all of the cards are on the table, known, and then the opponent choice happens. I'm pretty sure that's how that works. So you can ask your opponents to say, hey, who will give me this generous gift that we need to remove whatever, Itali or Galta or something like that. So a lot of sort of depth to this card, but it also triggers a lot of our synergy pieces. And, you know, in the crazy case that we have a Terror Peaks on the field, it has 5 power, so even better. Reckless Impulse, 2 mana, Impulse draw 2. That's exactly what we want to be doing. Skull Clamp, notably it's in this deck because we make a lot of 1/1s via goblins, and we can also search this up with Urza Saga. So Skull Clamp is just a great include. The One Ring, I think most people know what this does, but in case you don't, 4 an indestructible artifact. When it enters the battlefield of casting, you gain protection from everything until your next turn, and then you can tap it to put a burden counter on it, then draw a card for each burden counter on it, and then at the beginning of your upkeep, you lose 1 life for each burden counter on the One Ring. So this is just a great way in mono red to draw cards, to sort of take the edge off of those blue decks that are drawing cards every turn. Ren's Resolve, 2 mana, impulse draw for 2. So again, just another great effect that we want to be doing. All right, we'll move on to the removal and interaction. So Abrade is a 2 mana Modal spell where we can either deal 3 damage to target creature or destroy target artifact. Now, a lot of these spells are, the assumption is that Torbran is on the field, so we increase all these damage numbers by 2. So dealing 5 damage to target creature will take out, I would say, 80 to 85% of creatures that you need to take out. Again, this deck is, you know, it doesn't deal as well with the big green fatties, so that's a little bit of a poorer matchup for the deck. Or we can destroy target artifacts, and again, with something like a Liquid Metal Torque on the battlefield, we can destroy any non-land permanent. Chandra's Incinerator is just a great card, 6/6 elemental for 5 and a red. However, this spell costs X less to cast, where X is the total amount of non-combat damage dealt to your opponents this turn. So it's effectively a 1 mana 6/6 with Trample. Whenever a source you control deals non-combat damage to an opponent, Chandra's Incinerator deals that much damage to a target creature or planeswalker that player controls. So this is going to start nuking creatures, assuming that you can keep casting spells to trigger your burn pieces, and this is going to snipe a lot of creatures. Chaos Warp is a red classic to get all of your enchantments and other pieces that you can't normally hit. Daggercaster is a 4 mana 2/3 Viashino rogue. When Daggercaster ETBs, it deals 1 damage to each opponent and 1 damage to each creature your opponents control. Now, these effects, which I'll call in the festivities types of effects to deal the 1 to your opponents and creatures, are only really good with Torbran on the field. So one of the weaknesses is if Torbran receives a lot of hate, these cards get way worse. So being able to deal 3 to each opponent and each creature they control will snipe most of the utility creatures for the field. And if you were to cast even multiple of these in the same turn, it effectively represents a one-sided board wipe because most creatures will die to having 6 damage dealt to them. So, you know, Torbran is required to really make these cards powerful, but what I've noticed is that regardless of the damage, it's really nice to just deal 1 to everything anyway. Turns out there's just a lot of 1/1s that need to die. Token decks in particular is what I'm thinking about, aristocrat decks. Let's check out Zulaport Cutthroat. I know Blood Artist is 1 toughness, so that gets sniped. Zulaport Cutthroat. So any sort of like aristocrats pieces get sniped by this, which is great, and it doesn't target, so ward and hexproof and all that crap doesn't matter. And the festivities is the same effect, but for 1 mana, and it's a sorcery, most importantly. Frostbite is going to be essentially a lightning bolt, assuming we meet the snow permanence clause. And with Torbran on the field, a 1 mana deal 5, that's going to take care of most creatures. Goblin Chain Whirler is another and the festivities effect, but on a 3/3 first strike with a decent amount of devotion. Lightning Bolt is, you know, just deal 3, just unconditionally. Lightning Bolt, you know, this card I still am experimenting with more. I haven't yet found just cards to match the efficiency of Lightning Bolt in Commander, and I'm curious, like, if you were to track the data throughout the turns of a game, how many times lightning bolt would save you or would work for your purposes? Like what is the percentage of the time that this doesn't hit what you want it to get rid of? I would wager that even if it's useful 60% of the time, I think it's still just a great include because it's 1 mana. It triggers all of our non-creature based burn, and if you need to, it can then target an opponent to deal 5 as well. Release the Gremlins. XX and a red for a sorcery that destroys X target artifacts, create X 2/2 red gremlin creature tokens. So most of the time, I think we'd be casting this for a total of 3 mana, where X is 1. So we get to snipe an artifact, which is roughly 1 mana worth of value. And then we have 2 mana to create then a 1/1 red gremlin creature token. So that's great. You know, we'll take the loss in mana, for example. It still kind of falls into that Molten Birth category where we're not creating as many tokens on rate, but just the flexibility to allow us to snipe a bunch of stuff, maybe in the late game, or just play this for 3 in the early game, is worth running. And Tectonic Hazard is a new one from Lost Caverns, which is another in the festivities type of effect. So just some great, efficient AoE damage there. All right, and finally, we'll round out the deck tech with the mana base. So Dwarven Mine is going to be great in a mono red deck, and hopefully it will create us a 1/1 red dwarf creature token. Just a great utility land here. Forgotten Cave, I love the cycling lands, especially the 1 mana ones you run to run in like monocolor decks. Guildless Commons is a bounce land that's colorless, and I like this because it effectively draws us a basic, is like how I think of this. Nykthos, great in a devotion deck. Oliphant is a good creature in a pinch. However, most of the time we're going to treat this as a tapped MDFC land by cycling it with Mountain Cycling. Scavenger, oh, and notably, it can grab, I think, Dwarven Mine. Yeah, let's see, what are there? I think that's the one that you would want to search up, assuming that you can meet the condition just for the extra utility. I don't think we have any other mountains. Yeah, so Dwarven Mine is also a mountain if we wanted to search that. Scavenger Grounds are one piece of graveyard hate just to, yeah, there's no tutors for it, but there's some graveyard hate in the deck. Shadow Skull the Hammer Pass, a great damage dealing spell. MDFC, most of the time we're going to play it as a land, but in the 1 out of 10 cases where we can make use of that X cost, then that's going to save our bacon. Smoldering Crater, another cycler that we can pay 2 to draw a card if we're flooded, which, again, in mono red, especially running the cycling lands is important just because you don't want to get flooded. Silken's Crucible Defiance is an untapped red source, and in a pinch, if we're flooded, we can then make creatures from it, triggering our synergies. Urza Saga can search up Soul Ring and Skull Clamp. Valakut Stoneforge if we need to refresh our hand. Valakut the Molten Pinnacle. Let's see. Enters tapped. However, whenever a mountain enters a battlefield under your control, if you control at least 5 other mountains, you may have it deal 3 damage to a target creature or player. So in the late game, this starts sniping creatures, and with Torbran out, can even deal 5 damage to creatures or players. And then finally, we have War Room to help us draw some cards. And yes, I have used this more than once in this deck, just because, again, mono red, those cards, even though you're impulse drawing, they go away. So it's nice to just have some extra gas that can sit in your hand. And then finally, we'll just close out with some relevant stats here. So there are a total of 21 creatures. Let me double check that, actually. 21 creatures and 8 creature makers. That may not be creatures. Let's see, creatures 22. So it's actually 23 creatures. Let me add up that super quick. 23 creatures and 8 creature makers that are non-creatures. And then there are also 30 instants and sorceries. So just some, upping these numbers is building towards that soft synergy that we need to really make the deck hum. And so that is the deck. Now, again, there is just a lot of synergy built into the deck, and a lot of this relies on Torbran. Oh, you know what I forgot, actually? There's a couple of cards I forgot before I sort of close out with our outro, we have a very important piece, Delayed Blast Fireball. We can exile or foretell this for 2 and then cast it for 6. Usually we'll want to deal 2 damage to each opponent and each creature they control, and if it was cast from exile, it deals 5 damage to each opponent and each creature they control instead. So this is actually great synergy if it is impulse drawn sitting on exile. You don't even need to pay the foretell cost, you can just pay it and get that huge damage number. And then finally, sort of still on that protect Torbran line of thinking, we have a deflecting swat, which can be substituted for bolt bend if you do not want to pay the massive amount of dollars for this card. So Torbran is just a great commander if you want a quick commander game. Again, with burn, I just really like sometimes mono red, like you know what it's all about. Mono red, go burr. It's very simple game plan, and I feel like this deck in particular is well built just because we have so much of that soft synergy built into the deck to capitalize on our set of pieces here. So with that is the video, guys. Hopefully you all enjoyed it. If you did, feel free to leave a like on the video down below and subscribe for more content like this. I am currently doing deck techs for all of my commander decks, a total of 55 or 56, something like that. And so this is my second, so we have a long ways to go, but there is more to come if you enjoyed. So with that, I will thank you all for watching once again, and hopefully we will see you all in the next one.